Hello, and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and today's topic is Lecture 18, Jeffersonian America. In other words, what happens next after Jefferson is elected in the Revolution of 1800. Now, before we begin, as always, please hit pause on your screen, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect the key terms to each other and to their larger historical significance. So let's begin. Now, when we talk about Jeffersonian America, there's a lot of different directions that we could go. And as we already said, this was considered the Revolution of 1800. In other words, this was a new beginning politically for our country. But in many ways, it represented a number of changes in other areas as well, as we'll discuss going forward. But as you can see, I have a little tagline. I don't always do this, but this one seems particularly pertinent to this discussion. And that is, okay, great, we have this new country. And we had this issue in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts, that postponed or delayed immigrants' ability to become citizens. We had that three-fifths compromise where African American slaves are only three-fifths of a human being. And so my tagline today is, what does it mean to quote unquote be American? In other words, are there certain predisposed qualifications? And I want you to keep that in your mind because in many ways, this in some ways contradicts the Jeffersonian vision that he portrayed. So let's begin. Now, of course, you all know in 1800, that was called the Revolution of 1800, a bloodless revolution, a revolution nonetheless, a political revolution, because for the first time in our nation's history, political power has been transferred from one group, the Federalists, who believe in big, large, active federal government, to a party that believes the exact opposite, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. And for many respects, Jefferson believes that government is in the way. And very much so, Thomas Jefferson believes in what he called the yeoman farmer. In other words, that it was the farmer, the small yeoman farmer, who was the backbone of what a true American really was, because he argued that the farmer worked with his hands, he produced food and crops for the masses of people, and thus, by nature, he's not selfish. He produces for others. And of course, he's comparing this to the Federalist Party and those who support them, most prevalently bankers and industrialists, early industrialists at this point, but bankers, who he said were only interested in lining their own pockets, i.e., they were selfish, not supporting the nation, but, well, themselves. And so Jefferson puts a tremendous amount of faith in the common man. He believes that the common man is a farmer, someone who works with their hands. He's a landowner. And again, this goes very back to the old, Shakespearean British idea of being a landowner, of being independent and not being dependent, but at the same time embodies this idea of the greater good that Jefferson believes that small yeoman farmers believe in and that they contribute to. At the same time, though, Jefferson believes in the small government philosophy. Remember, he believes that government should be smaller, unlike the Federalist Party that wanted to enlarge it, as we saw in the case of course, Washington and Adams, but specifically Alexander Hamilton. And so Jefferson and those who followed him became known as Jeffersonians. They believe that our country needs to be successful. In other words, in order for our country to be great and to be successful, we need broad-based liberty and economic opportunity, which he says bankers don't facilitate. They want, they're selfish, right? Now, of course, let me preface all this by saying when they're saying these things, with very few exceptions, they're only talking about white men. Like, there's no women involved here. There's no African Americans, no other immigrant groups involved. But that does bring me back to my question of what does it mean to be an American? Because according to Jefferson, And Jeffersonians then, true Americans who contribute to society then, while he's willing to share broad-based liberty, willing to share the country and some power with them, the prerequisite is you are still a white man. Which goes back to my tagline. What does it mean to be an American? Well, first definition, white male. That is a true American. But I want to add a second caveat to that, or a second question. What does it mean to be white? Because at this time, the majority, at least we're usually taught, the majority of our country is British American or British ancestry. Well, they're white. But if you remember, we talked a lot about there were a number of, especially Germans in our country. Are Germans white? There were other groups as well from other parts of Europe. There were some French, and they weren't quite treated as well. And of course, did you have to be Protestant? Could you be Catholic? What about Scots and the Scots-Irish that dominated parts of Pennsylvania? Do they count? Well, apparently they did, at least for the purposes of they were in the country prior to the Revolution, and therefore, well, they can now become citizens. They were citizens. And of course, we saw the path of citizenship change under Adams as the residency requirement lengthened from 5 to 14 years. Which, by the way, it will go back down to fewer than 10 years within the first few years of Jefferson administration. But my question, though, is, so who then is considered a good American? He says a farmer. But that's a very broad definition because aren't African Americans farmers? Slaves? I mean, they are farmers. And obviously he's not talking about them. So let's go on and see if we can pick this up and what I mean by this. Now, Jefferson believed in a small government, but yet he almost immediately contradicts himself in many respects. He does so, though, for he believes are good purposes. And of course, in order to ensure the success of the future of America and the small yeoman farmer, there is one thing you must have: land, and lots of it. If you want to have a country of farmers, which most of America was a farming country at the time, farmers always need more land to grow more crops, to produce more food, to feed more people as the population grows. So given Jefferson's political vision, again, this is a contradiction in some ways, because remember, his political ideology is to shrink government. Government's in the way. But one of Jefferson's greatest achievements and legacy was doubling the size of the United States. And of course, that is done by what's called the Louisiana Purchase. Now, see, in 1803, the United States, we have these farmers in this area in Tennessee, Kentucky, and they had a problem. I mentioned the last time with the Whiskey Rebellion, is it's expensive and difficult to get your land or your crops to places to sell it, especially to ports to sell it across the seas. And so what they wanted was a port city in the South. Now, the best port city was at the mouth of the Mississippi River, because the Mississippi River traveled the entire length on the western border. And this would, in traveling up and down the Mississippi, would allow farmers to get their crops to, well, across the seas, to international markets. The problem was where the Mississippi dumps into is a place called New Orleans, which was not owned by the United States. Now remember, if you remember correctly, at the end of the Revolution, it was given back to Spain. However, by 1803, the French had taken over it, and of course, Napoleon is right now emperor in France. And so in 1803, Jefferson sends a couple of diplomats to France to negotiate with Napoleon Bonaparte, trying to acquire access to the port of New Orleans, the port of Orleans. However, Napoleon's in a predicament at the time. He's happy to sell. He needs money because he's gearing up for another round of warfare across the continent of Europe. And he wants to expand France, make France great. And so when these two diplomats arrive in France. They're like, hey, we're inquiring for President Jefferson. Would you be willing to say, let us utilize the port of New Orleans? And Bonaparte's like, you know what? How about this? How about I just sell you this entire area of land, Louisiana, all the way up through half of the continent of what is now the United States? And of course, these guys are like, wow, we are master negotiators. Of course, the fact was Napoleon needed money. Of course, these two negotiators come back. They talk to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's like, wait, what? That goes against my every vision of small government. We are doubling the size of the United States. This is, seriously, this is going to be a nightmare politically because you are doubling the United States, which means you have to have government officials to administrate this new land. You have to scout this new land. You have to defend this new land. But this is too good of a deal to pass up. Napoleon is offering some 830 million square acres. 830 million acres for $15 million. This is pennies on the acre. This is a great deal no matter how you look at it. But it does draw into question an inherent contradiction in Thomas Jefferson. Do you want to shrink government, Jeffersonian vision, Democratic Republican platform, smaller government, government's in the way? Or do you want to use your power to increase the land size to secure the future farmers of America? And of course, ultimately, he chose to, buy the land. And again, it's the obviously right decision, but it does leave Jefferson open to criticism. So great, we bought this new land. Of course, Lewis and Clark would go scout it out, Sacagawea, and of course, that's all you can read in your textbook. But I want to talk about a separate problem now. Because the reality is you bought all this land, and there are a lot of people living there. This would be a recurring trend in our history. There's a lot of people living there. On the one hand, there's thousands of Native Americans. Now, you know how we feel about Native Americans, historically speaking. We don't like them. They're in our way. It's their fault because they were on our land before we got there. And we will either steal their land, kill them, push them off their land, or through some surreptitious means, get the land from them. So we're going to ignore them for the moment. We'll come back to Native Americans later in this lecture. Instead, I want to focus on specifically those French, Spanish, and even free blacks who are living in what is now essentially the state of Louisiana. Because this is the area, remember, this is the area we're primarily concerned with. We want the port. And of course, Napoleon is concerned as well about these people because they are his people. They are Frenchmen. And so what we find here is another conundrum for Jefferson to deal with that, again, is a stark contradiction to what he believes is the function of government. So again, my question, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be accepted as a true participatory citizen? And what we find here is when they buy the Louisiana Purchase, there are about 34,000 whites plus 3,200 free people of color, which means about 11% of the population was free persons of color. Who these free persons of color enjoyed the rights of free people in French society in the Louisiana area. But were French people white? And then what do you do with 3,200 free blacks? Well, we have a problem though now. So the question is, what does our law say? Well, if you go back to 1790, the question is, in 1790, we laid out the original requirements for citizenship. And it said that only free white people could become citizens after a 2-year residency period. And that is assuming they were of good character, i.e. no criminal. And they would swear an oath to support the Constitution. So it's a very simple requirement to become a citizen back in 1790. This is our kind of first major immigration or citizenship act laws. So 1790 was very simple. You must have 2 years in the country. You must be of good character, not a criminal. And you must swear an oath of loyalty to the Constitution. Oh, and you must be a free white person. There are no Africans allowed to become citizens or African Americans. And of course, over the years, we changed those laws slightly by 1803 Louisiana Purchase. But really, the only thing that changed was the length of residency. So, for instance, that was 1790. 5 years later, 1795, we increased the residency requirement to 5 years. In 1798, we increased it to 14 years, of course, in the Sedition Act. And then in 1802, under Jefferson, we will reduce it back down to 8 years. And so the question is, what do you do with these people? Are these considered good American citizens? Well, we could have applied current law, which was, of course, the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance had made a very clear role of how a territory becomes a state, and thus their inhabitants become citizens. And it was very simple. The Northwest Ordinance stated that you must have 60,000 free whites before you're able to, first of all, draft a constitution, elect a legislature, and then apply for statehood. However, the original Louisiana area actually included about half of what is now southern Missouri. So half the state of Missouri, the southern half. In which case, there were approximately 52,000 free whites, plus the other 3,200 free people of color that were considered French citizens. And therefore, surely, if you draw this entire area, that the question more is whether you include the free persons of color or not. But if you include them, you're at somewhere close to about 55,000 people. Surely, in a matter of a couple of years, it'd be easy to apply for statehood, which means at least 52,000 Frenchmen become citizens. And this is very scary to Americans in 1803. Because Frenchmen are different, at least we thought. In other words, they weren't considered white enough. You see a little chart on there. It's not a chart from the 1800s, but the idea is there are different gradations of what we consider white. There are different levels of whiteness. In other words, there are different levels of citizenship in how we accept people. You may be a citizen, but not very accepted. You may not be a citizen, but may be accepted. And so the question was, what do you do with all these Frenchmen? And for the United States, we did some very kind of devious, underhanded things here, trying to preserve America for quote-unquote true Americans, white males. So what did we do first? The first thing our government did was we said, no. That's too many people in one area. So we subdivided this area. We got rid of what is this now the state of Missouri and drew the border further south, which is, of course, the modern-day state of Louisiana. Well, the change here was we went from 52,000 free whites to now just 34,000. Again, a far cry from the 60,000 we need to apply for statehood according to the Northwest Ordinance. First problem. Why is the question? Why are Frenchmen not considered white? Why are they not considered good citizens? Well, there's a few issues here. Number one is a language issue. It was reasoned that Frenchmen were not considered good American citizenship, good candidates for citizenship, because they spoke French, not English. And of course, English is the official language, right? Right? Yeah. Still to this present day, English is not the official language of the United States. Yes, most of our official documents are in English, granted. It is not our official language. And so this is more of a xenophobic reaction. They can't possibly be good Americans, they don't speak English. Sound familiar? Second problem besides language. Our government officials reasoned that Frenchmen couldn't handle a trial by jury. Our Constitution, Bill of Rights says that every American is guaranteed a right to trial by jury of their peers. And their argument was because of the French legal code, that they've been indoctrinated with all their lives, that they surely would not be able to understand the comprehensive nature of our judicial system. Because, we have umpteen years of experience with our current legal system. Wait, this is 1803. So we formed the Constitution in 1787, so we're talking 16 years. Yep, we have a long history of this. Number 3, we said that, no. Well, they still favor the French form of government in a monarchy. Of course, at that point, we have Emperor Napoleon. So they're still loyal to him. They won't be loyal to our government. Again, our long history of government, which was about 16 years. 4th big issue, they were Catholic. And again, I understand there's differences nowadays, but for so many hundreds of years, there's this tremendous animosity between Catholics and Protestants. And they were Catholics. And the fear of Catholics is a few different ones. One is not Protestant. But the other issue is that there's a loyalty issue here. That many Protestants believe that Catholics were loyal to the Pope, to the Church, to the Pope, not to a country. In other words, it was faith before country. It was loyal to the Pope before loyalty to the President. And this becomes problematic as far as questioning their authenticity, questioning their loyalty. And then lastly, there was one additional question. And that was the question over, does the President or Congress, do they have the power to grant wholesale mass citizenship to a people of a foreign nation? Is this even constitutionally legal? Remember, now I would tell you without hesitation that Alexander Hamilton would say, well, yes, this is general welfare of our country, right? Expand the powers. Again, loose interpretation. But Jefferson's strict interpretation. And so does Jefferson believe he has the power to do this, or Congress does, under the Constitution, under this strict interpretation? And there's a big question. Remember, this is a big deal. Do you really want to set a precedent like this? Especially Thomas Jefferson. Again, Hamilton? Sure. Adams? Why not? Washington? Probably. They're Federalists. But Democratic Republicans and Jeffersonians are small government. Strict interpretation of the Constitution. And thus, go back to your question, can they do this? Well, as you can see, though, the people of Louisiana were very upset by this because the treaty that actually ceded Louisiana to the United States said, quote, the inhabitants of the ceded territory shall be incorporated into the Union of the United States and admitted as soon as possible. And they will enjoy the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. In other words, they believe, they take this to mean that as soon as possible, they will become citizens of the United States. And they want this. Now, I'm not saying they were happy they were sold, but they want to become citizens. And they immediately form their own state legislature. But the United States says, wait, no. It says as soon as possible. We decide as soon as possible, not you. And so in the immediacy of 1803, the question of when is as soon as possible? Now, according to the Frenchmen of Louisiana, this was, well, tomorrow. According to the United States government, this was, we'll decide when it gets to the point. So what's the issue here? Well, first of all, the United States government will appoint a territorial governor to oversee this new territory, which that's the first thing that really upsets and ticks off the Frenchmen. Like, no. We want to elect a person. That is the democratic idea, right? Isn't that what America stands for? Democracy, and vote for your leaders, representative government. And one of the first things we do as a country to these new Louisiana residents was appoint a governor. So what is his opinion of them? Well, here you go. Provisional Governor 1804. He says that, quote, the principles of a popular government are utterly beyond their comprehension. The representative system is an enigma. It bewilders them. Not 1 in 50 appear to understand English language. Trials by jury will only embarrass. I do fear a representative government would be a dangerous experiment. So again, he highlights all these major issues. Language, trial by jury, loyalty. And The proof of this not only was in their court system, but even in their newspapers. There were approximately 12 major newspapers in the Louisiana Territory in 1803, 1804. And of course, the majority of them were in French. Big surprise. In fact, 8 of the 12 were in French. There was one that was partly in Spanish, and of course, there were a couple that were in English. And they believed that these Frenchmen needed an Americanization process to create good citizens. In other words, make them whiter or make them more acceptable to white Americans. Now, over the course of the next 8 years, Louisiana will finally get their citizenship in 1812. Let's see. So let's flash forward to 1812 now. Louisiana will finally become a state. So what changes in those 8 years? Pretty much nothing. A couple more newspapers were in English, but over half of them were still in French. How many of you guys been in New Orleans? Aren't all the street signs Rue de Bourbon? In other words, they're still in French. I don't know if you notice the signs as you're driving through Louisiana, they're all called parishes, not counties. That's based on French, governmental policies. And quite honestly, much of Louisiana's state legal code is still based on French law. So the reality is Louisianans didn't really give in. They didn't change much. So what did change? Well, ultimately, not a lot. Louisiana was allowed to enter in 1812. Still, most of the people spoke French. Most of the legal traditions are still in place from France. The legal code has still many elements different from the English common law that we follow in the rest of our country. And ultimately, what does make 1812 a good year is a war year. And so it becomes politically expedient for us to get them in just so we can focus on the war at hand, which we'll discuss in our next lecture. But for note right now, this is the first time a sizable body of non-British citizens or non-British people with a different language, legal and political systems, customs, and religion are allowed to become members of the United States. And again, this will be something that has to be brought up again, so keep this in mind. This is a big deal. This is what's happening in the South. So we're going to transition now what's going on in the Midwest, or back then the Northwest. And then in the next lecture, we'll talk about what's going back on in the East. So we're going to move from the South on upward to what was back then the Northwest, modern day Midwest, the Great Lakes region. And in the Great Lakes region, we were dealing with a new problem. And that, of course, is Native Americans. Because before we can even start to settle all that wonderful new territory of the Louisiana Purchase, picture right there, there's still this lot of area, as you see it there, called the Indiana and Michigan territories. And this area is still not largely settled by white Americans. Rather, who does live there is thousands of Native Americans. And of course, big surprise, what Native Americans are facing here is constant encroachment due to American expansion. And Americans keep moving on their land, and basically their choice is to either defend their land or leave. Now, it's during this period in the early 1800s that we see a couple of Native American tribes, especially a couple of Native Americans, who will begin to develop and rise as leaders or emerge as leaders in a movement to push against white expansion. And one of the most famous of them was a man by the name of Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh was a very popular Native American. He was a very eloquent speaker. And basically, when he talked, people listened. He was a successful warrior. And when he goes out to fight, people want to fight for him and with him. And he begins to argue that Native Americans need to join together. In other words, stop bickering among tribal factions. They need to join together and fight against their common enemy, white people, Americans. And he says, you can't keep giving up on these treaties because all they do is white Americans, they keep breaking these treaties. You sign these treaties, you give up land, they promise you the world, they promise to leave you alone, and they come and encroach again. You got to stop this. And so basically, you need to defend your land. And if that means violently, then so be it. You can't survive if you don't have land. Wait, isn't that the same philosophy Thomas Jefferson had? We need land to survive as a country. Well, Indians felt the same way. Now, Tecumseh, though, does not do this alone. He's got a brother. And he's one of those brothers. The brother that your parents hope doesn't come home for Christmas, because if he does, he's just going to do something really embarrassing. The black sheep of the family, if you will. They're very different. Tecumseh is popular, destined to be great, destined to be a leader, and the prophet basically talks too much, poor hunter, poor warrior, and is a consummate drunk. I don't mean he drinks a little bit too much. This guy chugs a lot. As in, it's common, he'll go on these benders and just be passed out. This is a normal thing for him. But then, the prophet, his brother, goes on the bender of all benders. This dude gets so drunk and so wasted, he passes out for days. So much so that everyone thought he was dead. They begin planning his pyre for his funeral. And suddenly, he awakes. And he has a vision. I'm sure he did. Probably more than one. But he has this vision that said, this awakening, said Native Americans need to expel European influence by not giving up their land and stop drinking. And everybody's like, yeah, right, whatever. You're the town drunk, basically. No one believes you. But the longer the prophet stayed sober, the more people started to listen to him. And sure enough, he did stay sober. And so they become this very formidable team, Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet. Because Tecumseh was the military genius. People loved to listen to him. But the prophet became the spiritual side of things. And together they formed a powerhouse team that was able to build a strong pan-Indian coalition. And they began to go out on recruiting missions. They began to recruit more and more tribes to their goal and begin to amass a small army. And of course, they were getting a lot of help and encouragement from their neighbors to the north. You may remember them, the British. Go back to my map. If you remember correctly, the British are still in Canada, right? Remember I told you it was surrounded by enemies on all sides. And the British were doing their part by providing guns and weapons and just general support, saying, yeah, hey, we'll support you. Go attack those Americans. Please do. Weaken them for us. And so between the two of them, with Tecumseh focusing on the military aspects of the Pan-Indian Alliance, and the prophet focusing on the spiritual idea that there's an Indian path, there's a white path, let's stay on the Indian path, don't drink, don't give up your land. They begin to forge a strong Pan-Indian alliance, and they settle right there. You see on the map a place called Tippecanoe. So right there in northern Indiana, what is now northern Indiana, back then in the Indiana Territory, a place called Tippecanoe. And they set up the headquarters there of this resistance movement. And of course, they're getting lots of encouragement from the north, from the British. Well, the territorial governor of Indiana Territory was a man by the name of William Henry Harrison. Remember his name, we'll be back later. And he was worried about all the military activity in this region. And of course, not only him, but all the white settlers around the headquarters of Tippecanoe were extremely disturbed by the increasing power of Tecumseh and his brother and the followers. And so in 1811, the governor of the territory, General William Henry Harrison, he organized a small army of 1,000 men, hoping to make some headways. And the reason he gathered this 1,000-man army, particularly in late summer 1811, was because Tecumseh was gone on a recruiting mission down in Kentucky and Tennessee. So in the summer of 1811, Tecumseh left Tippecanoe he left the prophet in charge, and he travels south into Kentucky and Tennessee on a recruiting mission to, again, get more Indians to join their cause. They weren't strong enough yet in Tecumseh's mind. And so, late summer, Tecumseh's gone. Governor William Henry Harrison gathers 1,000 men, and they march up to Tippecanoe, hoping to destroy this alliance before Tecumseh returns. And so on November 6, 1811, the regiment arrives. They meet with representatives of the prophet, and basically they mutually agree that there will be no hostilities tonight. They will meet together and discuss anything the following day. So Harrison's scouts then go just outside the area, find a suitable campsite on a very wooded hill about a mile west. But Harrison's no fool. Now, at least not yet. We'll discuss later where he is. But Harrison warns his men, saying, "Men, the prophet cannot be trusted." And so he told his troops to sleep in what was called a quadrangular formation, military formation. In other words, make it easy to get up and be ready to defend themselves. He also ordered each man to sleep fully clothed with his weapon loaded. And he had lit fires not only to combat the cold, rainy night, but also so they could see a little better of any oncoming ambush. Now, please note, Tecumseh had warned his brother, whatever you do not attack the Americans. We're not ready yet. If we do, we'll lose. And of course, the person says, yeah. You're the military guy. Go do your recruiting trip. And so, sure enough, in the middle of the night, the prophet had whipped his men up with a fiery oration of spiritual ideas, including telling them that the white man's bullets would not harm them. We know this from history. Also, if you look at the little newspaper clipping on your screen right now, you see where it says in the very bottom, the prophet had told them the white man would be asleep or drunk, and it goes on to say that the white man's bullets will not harm them if they're shot. Again, he's the spiritual side of things, not the military tactician. Now, of course, because Harrison hadn't been prepared for this, the sentinels on duty saw them coming. The first gunshot was fired as soon as the warriors' yells were heard. And at this point, a very quick, bloody battle. And these army men were able to pretty easily fend off this reckless but determined Indian attack. 2 hours later, 37 soldiers were dead, 25 others were to die of injuries later, and 126 were wounded. Which, that's a pretty good success. They killed 37. 25 would die later from wounds, and 126 were wounded in general, out of 1,000. So you have a couple hundred that are, you got them. We don't have the exact numbers of the Indians who died. And you see the headline there. We're not really sure in history, but it's almost irrelevant. Because what this Battle of Tippecanoe did, this battle here with the prophet, it broke the will of the Indians. Because remember, this has been a plan for a long time by Tecumseh. And the prophet had used these spiritual ideas of, hey, we're impervious to bullets. And losing this battle basically broke the pan-Indian alliance that had been building from Tecumseh the prophet. And of course, 3 months later, Tecumseh returns, finds his dream dead. He doesn't quite kill his brother, though I probably should have. But basically, Tecumseh says, okay, this is useless. We can't rebuild this confederation of Indians. Instead, he decided that the best chance for survival of Native Americans was to join the British. And sure enough, he will gather his remaining forces. He will head north into near Canada, and he will join with the British. And quite honestly, Tecumseh will play a very key role in the upcoming War of 1812. But that'll be a discussion that we will have next time. For now, though, just know that there was a lot of turmoil in the Southwest, in Louisiana, over whether or not they can become citizens. In the Northwest back then. There was a lot of turmoil between Indians and whites, and you see a lot of warfare going on as the Indians try to make a quote-unquote last stand there. But what's going on back east may trump both of those things for the biggest issue in the 1810s under this small government vision of Jeffersonian America. But that's a discussion for next time. So until next time, bye-bye.